We have yet to hear much from the Russian President Vladimir Putin over the allegation that his country, perhaps his office, was behind the poisoning of the double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Perhaps this is because he has been engaged in the electoral fight of his life, battling for a fourth term in presidential elections which take place today. But he hasn't. Few elections have been so universally derided. The only credible challenger, Alexei Navalny, has been barred from standing, and the Russian media has fallen slavishly into line. Mr. Navalny called on Russians to boycott the election. Turnout seems to be pretty much the only variable in this poll. Our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford is at a polling station in the capital. Sarah, have we got an early idea of turnout?
Well, according to the Electoral Commission here, they're saying it's significantly higher than it was in 2012, so the last time there was a presidential election here. The figure for 12 o'clock local time was 35%, which was about 4% up. We haven't had the latest figures since then, that's 4 hours ago. But certainly it does seem to be higher across the board, across the country. There's not an obvious sign of that boycott that you mentioned that Alexei Navalny called for. And in fact, at the polling stations themselves, especially here in Moscow, although Moscow is a place where fewer people traditionally vote, the turnout's traditionally quite low in the big cities like this. I have to say there's a all-in major effort to get people out to vote. There is all manner of things going on at the polling stations. You can probably hear a bit of Russian pop in the background here, but at the polling station I was at before, there was a man on a balalaika playing The Clash. There was a giant rabbit. There's, in fact, where I am now, there's a man dressed up as a giant parrot in front of me and a big chessboard, and there's lots of children's games. There's cheap food and the music, as I said. So every effort to get as many people out as possible to vote, to make this a kind of a festival atmosphere, a festive atmosphere, and to, I suppose, achieve that key thing, which is supposed to be this high turnout, because President Putin knows that he's all set to win this election, but he wants legitimacy. He wants to be able to turn around and say, look, the majority of Russian citizens have voted for me. They want me for another 6 years, and I'm here to stay.
Briefly, Sarah, is there a figure we should be looking for below which the Kremlin starts to get concerned?
I don't think there's any danger of the Kremlin being concerned today at all. I mean, 65% was the the turnout last time. I don't think it's going to be any lower. I expect it'll be significantly higher. But certainly, as I say, they've put in every possible effort to try and bring it up this time. And as I say, no real sign of the boycott. And certainly, actually, just, Johnny, another thing, I mean, just talking to people here, I'd have to say that around about 70% of the people I've spoken to do support Vladimir Putin very genuinely. There's nothing forced about it. They think he's a strong leader. They think he's made Russia strong again. And they would be very happy to see him here for another 6 years.
Sarah Rainsford in Moscow, many thanks. Enjoy your election. This morning, the Russian ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Putin, suggested that the nerve agent that left Sergei and Yulia Skripal in intensive care might have been manufactured at the British government research laboratories at Porton Down. Absolute nonsense, said the Foreign Office. The Foreign Secretary said that the government had evidence that not only had the Russian state been developing and stockpiling the nerve agent Novichok for a decade, but that it had been developing ways to deliver the crippling poison. The British government boasts that it has expressions of support from some 20 countries on 6 different continents. Tomorrow, Boris Johnson will head to Brussels to try to rally further European assistance. But how deep is that commitment, and do Russian officials actually believe what they say when it comes to this poisoning? So Roderic Lyne was Britain's ambassador to Russia between 2000 and 2004. Walter Schwimmer was Secretary General of the Council of Europe, a body that upholds human rights and the rule of law, and was an Austrian MP. Gentlemen, welcome. May I start with you, Sir Roderic? Vladimir Putin says it was the Brits all along. What do you make of that claim?
Vladimir Putin says what he's told to say, and the KGB, now rebranded as the FSB, doesn't tell the Foreign Ministry what it's up to. In 2004, I sat in his office when he was a Deputy Foreign Minister, and he assured me that there'd be no further KGB attacks on the British Council. Actually, as we were sitting there, the KGB were breaking into the British Council. I don't question his good faith. He simply doesn't know what's going on, and he's spouting his lines. It's complete nonsense.
And what of the good faith of other senior officials? We've heard a lot of comment from Sergei Lavrov over the last few days. Do you think he believes what he says, or is it all an elaborate smokescreen?
Once again, he is paid to be the face of the Russian government in foreign affairs. He is not a decision maker. he says what he's required to say.
We've heard some pretty direct criticism from Vladimir Chizov towards Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, who told Russia that it should go away and shut up. If you'd been a Foreign Office a Foreign Office official advising your minister, would you have advised him to use that kind of language?
I don't think we should get diverted. This is a deliberate attempt to distract the argument away from the fact that nerve agent has been used for the first time since the Second World War. That is an offence against the Chemical Weapons Convention. There is a very wide feeling of concern about it in the international community, and this is simply trying to throw sand in our eyes. So let's not go down that track.
Walter Schwimmer, may I ask you, the British Foreign Secretary is going to Brussels tomorrow. He will want an expression of support, a full-throated one, from European Union foreign ministers. Do you think he should receive that?
I am concerned about the return of Cold War rhetorics. And I don't like the mutual accusations we can realize for the moment. There is nothing overwhelmingly likely, as Mr. Johnson pointed out. I cannot say it's overwhelmingly likely that Russia is not behind the attack, and he has no right to say it's overwhelmingly likely that Putin is directly behind this attack. So this is Cold War rhetorics, and I'm really worried. I lived 40 decades near to the Iron Curtain, 60 kilometers from Vienna. I don't want to return to this time.
Your perspective, I acknowledge, is different. The Austrian perspective is very different from the British perspective, certainly. But had an attack like this been carried out in, say, Innsbruck, had a Russian defector been poisoned in Innsbruck?
It must be clarified. I think one should cooperate with Russia. Russia has the obligation to assist the clarification of the attack. The attack is a terrible crime, there's no doubt about. And he also should be found guilty and should be punished. But I'm a lawyer by education, and it's a basic principle in democracies ruled by law that not the accused one has to prove his innocence, but the accuser has to prove the guilt.
Well, the accuser in this case, the British government, says it is pretty sure that the Russians are responsible for this attack simply because of the sourcing of the nerve agent. I ask you again, if Austria had suffered an attack like this on its soil and turned round to its European allies and said, can we have your support, you would fully expect that support, wouldn't you?
Support for what?
Well, support for a common stance.
Or for the clarification?
Well, a support for a common stance against Russia.
I don't think that's the right way. That doesn't lead to clarification of the whole case.
Your critics would say
cooperation with Russia.
Your critics would say this is exactly what Vladimir Putin and the Russian state wants and expects: a divided Europe, which it finds very easy to pick off allies, neutrals, and opponents.
No, I don't think so. That supposes that Putin is behind the attack, and I don't believe that. My common sense says, why should he order to kill somebody who was released 8 years ago with a poison which is obvious of Russian development or Soviet development, so that everybody puts the finger immediately on Russia. So that's my common sense says this is not believable.
Sir Roderic Lyne, common sense says it's not believable.
The President of Russia must take responsibility for the actions of his security agencies. The Russian government has not attempted to cooperate in any way in this affair. And this is indeed an offence not just against Britain, it's an offence against Austria as an EU member, as a signatory of the Chemical Weapons Convention, as a member of the Council of Europe, which believes in human rights and the rule of law, and of which Mr. Schwimmer was the Secretary of General 19 years ago. I think we have got to pursue this in a very measured way, as Theresa May has done, based on the evidence. The rule of law is extremely important in this country. It really doesn't run in Russia. And we must make sure that the international community takes this very seriously at the UN, in the EU, in the Chemical Weapons Convention, maybe at the G7 summit later this year. This is no trivial matter.
Sir Roderic Lyne, Walter Schwimmer, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.